Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today Wayne continues to read Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Always remember that as we go through these amazing stories and read these outstanding adventures, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link in order to follow along with the words. Now I think that Bumblebee will be perfect to join us for today's adventure. Now that Bumblebee's here, let's jump in. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 6, Talons and Tealeaves. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered the Great Hall for breakfast the next day, the first thing that they saw was Draco Malfoy, who seemed to be entertaining a large group of Slytherins with a very funny story. As they passed, Malfoy did a ridiculous impression of a swooning fit, and there was a roar of laughter. "Ignore him," said Hermione, who was right behind Harry. "Just ignore him, it's not worth it." "Hey Potter," shrieked Pansy Parkinson, a Slytherin girl with a face like a pug. "Potter, the Dementors are coming! Potter!" Ooh. Harry dropped into a seat at the Gryffindor table next to George Weasley. "New third-year course schedules," said George, passing them over. "What's up with you, Harry?" "Malfoy," said Ron, sitting down on George's other side, glaring over at the Slytherin table. George looked up in time to see Malfoy pretending to faint in terror again. "That little git," he said calmly. "He wasn't so cocky last night when the Mentors were down on our end of the train. Came running into our apartment, didn't he, Fred?" "Nearly wet himself," said Fred, in a contentious glance to Malfoy. "I wasn't too happy myself," said George. "They're horrible things, those Dementors. Sort of freeze you up inside, don't they?" said Fred. "You didn't pass out though, did you?" said Harry in a low voice. "Forget it, Harry," said George bracingly. "Dad had to go out to Azkaban one time, remember, Fred? And he said it was the worst place he'd ever been. He came back all weak and shaking. They suck the happiness out of the place, Dementors. Most prisoners go mad there." "Anyway, we'll see how happy Malfoy looks over his first Quidditch match," said Fred. "Gryffindor versus Slytherin. First game of the season, remember?" The only time Harry and Malfoy had faced each other in a Quidditch match, Malfoy had definitely come off worse. Feeling slightly more cheerful, Harry helped himself to sausages and fried tomatoes. Hermione was examining her new schedule. "Oh good, we're starting some new subjects today," she said happily. "Hermione," said Ron, frowning as he looked over his shoulder. "They've messed up your schedule. Look, they've got you down for 10 subjects a day. There isn't even enough time." "I'll manage. I fixed it all up with McGonagall." "But look," said Ron laughing, "see this morning. 9 o'clock divination, and then underneath, 9 o'clock Muggle studies, and..." Ron leaned closer to the schedule, disbelieving. "Look, under that, arithmancy at 9 o'clock. I mean, I know you're good, Hermione, but no one's that good. How are you supposed to be in 3 classes at once?" "Don't be silly," said Hermione shortly. "Of course I won't be in 3 classes at once." "Well then, pass the marmalade," said Hermione. "Oh Ron, what's it to you if my schedule's a bit full?" Hermione snapped. "I told you, I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall." Just then, Hagrid entered the Great Hall. He was wearing his long moleskin overcoat and was absentmindedly swinging a dead polecat from another's hand. "All right," he said eagerly, pausing on his way to the staff table. "You're in for your first lesson, right after lunch. Been up since 5 getting them ready. Hope it's okay. Me, a teacher, honestly." He grinned broadly at them and headed off to the stable, swinging the polecat. "I wonder what he's been getting ready," said Ron, a note of anxiety in his voice. The hall was starting to empty as people headed off to their first lesson. Ron checked his first course. "We'd better go. Look, divination at the North Tower. It'll take us 10 minutes to get there." They finished their breakfast hastily and said goodbye to Fred and George and walked back through the hall. As they passed the Slytherin table, Malfoy did another impression of a fainting fit. The shouts of laughter followed Harry to the entrance of the hall. The journey through the castle in the North Tower was a long one. 2 years at Hogwarts hadn't taught them everything about the castle, and they had never been inside the North Tower before. "There's got to be a shortcut," Ron panted, as they climbed their 7th staircase and emerged on an unfamiliar landing, where there was nothing but a large painting of a bare stretch of grass hanging on the stone wall. "I think it's this way," said Hermione, peering down the empty passage to the right. "Can't be," said Ron. "That's south. Look, you can see a bit of the lake on the window." Harry was watching the painting. Fat Doppelgray Pony had just ambled onto the grass and was grazing nonchalantly. Harry was used to the subject that Hogwarts paintings moving and leaving their frames to visit one another, but he always enjoyed watching it. A moment later, a short, squat knight in a suit of armor clinking into the picture after his pony. By the look of the grass stains of the metal knees, he had just fallen off. "Aha!" he yelled, seeing Harry, Ron, and Hermione. "What villains are these that trespass in my private lands? Come to scorn my fall, perchance? Draw, you knaves, you dogs!" They watched in astonishment as the little knight tugged his sword out of his scabbard and began brandishing it violently, hopping up and down in rage. But the sword was too long for him. A particularly wild swing made him overbalance, and he landed face down in the grass. "Are you all right?" said Harry, moving closer to the picture. "Get back, you scurvy braggart! Back, you rogue!" The knight seized the sword again and used it to push himself back up, but the blade sank deeply into the grass, and though he pulled it up with all his might, he couldn't get it out again. Finally, he had to flop down on the grass and push up his visor to mop his sweating face. "Listen," said Harry, taking advantage of the knight's exhaustion. "We're looking for the North Tower. You don't know the way, do you?" "A quest?" The knight's rage seemed to vanish instantly. He clanked to the feet and shouted, "Come, follow me, dear friends, and we shall find our goal, or else shall perish bravely in the charge." He gave the sword another fruitless tug, tried and failed to mount his fat pony, gave up and cried, "On foot then, good sirs, and gentle lady, on, on!" He ran, clanking loudly, into the left side of the frame and out of sight. They hurried after him along the corridor, following the sound of his armor. Every now and then, they'd spot him running through a picture ahead. "Be of stout heart, the worst is yet to come," yelled the knight. They saw him reappear in front of an alarmed group of women in coilings, whose picture hung on the wall of a narrow spiral staircase. Puffing loudly, Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed tightly spiral staircases, getting dizzier and dizzier, until at last they heard a murmur of voices above them, and they knew they had reached the classroom. "Farewell," cried the knight, popping his head into the painting of the sinister-looking monks. "Farewell, my comrades in arms. If you ever are in need of noble heart and sternly sincere, call for Sir Cadogan." "Yeah, we will call for you," muttered Ron, as the knight disappeared, "if we ever need someone mental." They climbed the last few steps and emerged in a tiny landing, where most of the class was already assembled. There were no doors of this landing, but Ron nudged Harry and pointed to the ceiling, where there's a singular trapdoor with a brass plaque on it. "Sybil Trelawney, divination teacher," Harry read. "How are we supposed to get up there?" As though as an answer to his question, the trapdoor suddenly opened, and a silver ladder descended to his feet. Everyone got quiet. "After you," said Ron, grinning, so Harry climbed the ladder first. He emerged into the strangest-looking classroom he had ever seen. In fact, it didn't look like a classroom at all, more like a cross between someone's attic and an old-fashioned tea shop. At least 20 small circular tables were crammed inside it, all surrounded by chintz armchairs and fat little poofs. Everything was lit with dim crimson light. The curtains in the windows were all closed, and the many lamps were draped with dark red scarves. It was stiffingly warm, and the fire was burning under the crowded mantelpiece, was giving off a heavy, sickly port of perfume. It had heated a large copper kettle. The shelves running around the circular walls were crammed with dusty-looking feathers, stubs of candles, many packs of tattered playing cards, countless silvery crystal balls, and an array of teacups. Ron appeared at Harry's shoulder. The class assembled around them, all talking in whispers. "Where is she?" said Ron. A voice suddenly came out of the shadows. A soft, misty sort of voice. "Welcome," it said. "How nice to see you in the physical world at last." Harry's immediate impression was of a large, glittering insect. Professor Trelawney moved into the firelight, and they saw that she was very thin. Her large glasses magnified her eyes to several times their natural size, and she was draped in a gauzy, spangled shawl. Innumerable chains and beads hung from her speedy neck, and her arms and hands were encrusted with bangles and rings. "Sit, my children, sit," she said as they climbed awkwardly into armchairs and sank into poofs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat themselves around the same round table. "Welcome to divination," said Professor Trelawney, who had seated herself in a winged armchair in front of the fire. "My name is Professor Trelawney. You may not have seen me before. I find that descending too often into the hustle and bustle of the main school clouds my inner eye." Nobody had said anything to this extraordinary pronouncement. Professor Trelawney delicately rearranged her shawl and continued. "So you have chosen to study divination, the most difficult of all magic arts. I must warn you at the outset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books can only take you so far in this field." At those words, Harry and Ron glanced, grinning at Hermione, who looked startled at the news that books wouldn't be much help in this subject. Many witches and wizards, talented though they are, in the area of loud bangs and smells and sudden disappearings, are yet unable to penetrate the veiled mysteries. Professor Trelawney, her enormous eyes gleaming, moving from nervous face to nervous face. It is a gift granted to a few. You boy, she said suddenly to Neville, who almost immediately toppled off his poop. Is your grandmother? I think so, said Neville tremulously. I wouldn't be so sure if I were you, dear, said Professor Trelawney, the firefly glinting on her long emerald earrings. Neville gulped. Professor Trelawney continued placidly. We will be covering the basic methods of divination this year. The first term will be devoted to reading the Tealeaves. Next term we will progress to palmistry. And by the way, my dear, she shot Praviti Pratil. Beware a red-headed man. Praviti gave a startled look at Ron, who was right behind her, and edged her chair away from him. In the second term, Professor Trelawney went on, we shall progress to the crystal ball. If we have finished with fire omens, that is. Unfortunately, class will be disrupted in February 4th by a nasty bout of flu. I myself will lose my voice, and around Easter, one of our number will leave us forever. A very tense silence followed this pronouncement, but Professor Trelawney seemed unaware of it. I wonder, dear, she said to Lavender Brown, who was nearest and shrank back into her chair, if you could pass me the largest silver teapot. Lavender, looking relieved, stood up and took an enormous teapot from the shelf and put it down on the table in front of Professor Trelawney. Thank you, my dear. Incidentally, that thing you were dreading, it will happen on the Friday of the 16th of October. Lavender trembled. Now, I want you all to divide into pairs. Collect a teacup from the shelf and come to me. I will fill. Then sit down and drink until only the dregs made. Swirl these around in the cup 3 times with the left hand. Then turn the cup upside down on its saucer. Wait for the last of the tea to drain away. Then you give your cup to the partner to read. You will interpret the pattern using the pages 5 and 6 of Unfogging the Future. I shall move among you, helping and instructing. Oh dear, she caught Neville by the arm and made him stand up. After you've broken your first teacup, would you be so kind to select the one from the blue patterned ones? I'm rather attached to the pink. Sure enough, Neville had no sooner reached for the teacups when there was a trickle of breaking china. Professor Trelawney swept over to him, holding the dustpan and brush, and said, one of the blue ones, then, dear, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. When Harry and Ron had their teacups filled and went back to the table and tried to drink from the scalding water quickly, they swirled the drugs around like Professor Trelawney had instructed, then drained the cups and swapped over. Right, said Ron, as they both opened the books at page 5 and 6. What can you see in mind? A load of soggy brown stuff, said Harry, and the heavily perfumed smoke in the room was making him feel sleepy and stupid. Broaden your minds, my dear, and allow the eyes to see past the mundane, Professor Trelawney cried through the gloom. Harry tried to pull himself together. Right, you've got a crooked sort of cross, he consulted, Unfogging the Future. That means you're going through the trials and sufferings. Sorry about that, but there's something that could be the sun. Hang on. That means great happiness. So you're going to suffer, but be very happy. You need your inner eye tested if you ask me, said Ron, and they both had to stifle their laughs as Professor Trelawney gazed in their direction. My turn, said Ron, peered into Harry's teacup, and his forehead wrinkled with effort. There's a blot a bit like a bowler hat, he said. Maybe you're going to work in the Ministry of Magic. He turned the teacup the other way up. But this way it looks more like an anklet. What's that? He scanned the copy of the Unforgiving Future. A windfall. Unexpected gold? Excellent. You can lend me some. And there's a thing here. He turned the cup up again. That looks like an animal. Yeah. If that's its head, it looks like a hippo. No, a sheep. Professor Trelawney whirled around as Harry let out a snort of laughter. Let me see that, my dear, she said, reproving on Ron, sweeping over and snatching Harry's cup from him. Everyone was quiet to watch. Professor Trelawney was staring into the teacup, rotated it clockwise. The Talon, my dear. You have a deadly enemy. Well, everyone knows that, said Hermione in a loud whisper. Professor Trelawney stared at her. Well, they do, said Hermione. Everyone knows about Harry and you-know-who. Harry and Ron stared at her with a mixture of amazement and admiration. They had never heard Hermione speak to a teacher like that before. Professor Trelawney chose not to reply. She lowered her eyes to Harry again and continued to turn it, the club, and attack. My dear, this is not a happy cup. I thought it was a bowler hat, said Ron sheepishly. The skull, danger in your path, my dear. Everyone was staring, transfixed at Professor Trelawney, who gave the cup a turn and gasped, and then screamed. There was another trickle of breaking china. Neville had smashed the second teacup. Professor Trelawney sank into a vacant armchair, her glittering hand at her heart and her eyes closed. My dear boy, my poor dear boy, no. It is no kinder to say. No, don't ask me. What is a professor? Said Dean Thomas at once. Everyone had got to their feet and slowly crowded around Harry and Ron's table, pressing close to Professor Trelawney's chair to get a look at Harry's cup. "My dear," Professor's eyes opened dramatically. "You have the Grim." "The what?" said Harry. He could tell that he wasn't the only one who didn't understand. Dean Thomas shrugged at him and Lavender Brown looked puzzled, but nearly everyone else clapped their hands over their mouths in horror. "The Grim, my dear, the Grim!" cried Professor Trelawney, who looked shocked that Harry hadn't understood. "The giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards. My dear boy, it is an omen, the worst omen of death." Harry's stomach lurched. The dog on the cover of Death Omens and Flourish and Bots, the dog on the shadow of Magnolia Crescent. Lavender Brown clapped her hands over her mouth too. Everyone was looking at Harry, except Hermione, who had gotten up and moved to the back of Professor Trelawney's chair. "I don't think it looks like a Grim," she said flatly. Professor Trelawney surveyed Hermione with mounting dislike. "You'll forgive me for saying so, my dear, but I perceive very little aura around you. Very little receptivity to the resonance of the future." Seamus Finnegan was tilting his head from side to side. "It looks like a Grim if you did this," he said. His eye was almost shut. "But it looks like a donkey more from here," he said, leaning to the left. "When you've all finished deciding whether I'm going to die or not," said Harry, taking even himself by surprise. "I think we will leave the lesson here for today," said Professor Trelawney, in the mistiest voice. "Yes, please pack away your things." Silently, the class took their teacups back to Professor Trelawney, packed away their books, and closed their bags. Even Ron was avoiding Harry's eyes. "Until we meet again," said Professor Trelawney faintly. "Fair fortune to you, and oh dear," she pointed at Neville, "you'll be late next time, so mind extra hard to catch up." Harry and Ron and Hermione descended Professor Trelawney's ladder and winding down in silence, then set off to Professor McGonagall's transfiguration lesson. It took them so long to find her classroom. Early as they left divination, they were only just in time. Harry chose a seat right in the back of the room, feeling as though he was sitting in a very bright spotlight. The rest of the class kept shooting furtive glances at him, as though he were about to drop dead at any moment. He hardly heard what Professor McGonagall was telling them about animagi, wizards who could transform into animals at will, and wasn't even watching when she transformed herself in front of their eyes into a tabby cat with spectacular markings around her eyes. "Really, what has gotten into all of you today?" said Professor McGonagall, turning her back into herself with a faint pop and staring around at them. "Not all that it matters, but that's the first time my transfigurations has not gotten a pause from the class." Everyone's heads turned towards Harry again, but nobody spoke. Then Hermione raised her hand. "Please, Professor, we've just had our first divination class, and we were reading the Tealeaves, and—" "Of course," said Professor McGonagall, suddenly frowning. "There is no need for anyone to worry, Miss Granger. Tell me, which of you will be dying this year?" Everyone stared at her. "Me," said Harry. "I see," said Professor McGonagall, fixing Harry with her beady eyes. "Then you should know, Potter, that Sybil Treadle has predicted the death of a student a year since she arrived at the school. None of them have died yet. Seeing death omens is her favorite way of greeting a new class. If it were not for the fact that I will never speak ill of my colleagues." Professor McGonagall broke off, and they saw her nostrils had gone white. She went on more calmly. "Divination is one of the more imprecise branches of that. I shall not conceal from you that I have very little patience. True seers are very rare." And Professor Trelawney, she stopped again and then said, in a very matter-of-fact tone, "You look in an excellent health to me, Potter. So you will excuse me if I don't let you off for homework today. I assume that if you die, you will not need it in hand." Hermione laughed. Harry felt a little bit better. With a lump of tea leaves that waved from the dim red light and befuddling perfume from Professor Trelawney's classroom. Not everyone was convinced, however. Harry still looked worried, and Lavender whispered, "But what about Neville's cup?" When the Transfiguration class had finished, they joined the crowd thundering toward the Great Hall for lunch. "Ron, cheer up," said Hermione, pushing a dish of stew towards him. "You heard what Professor McGonagall said." Ron spooned the stew onto his plate, then picked up a fork that didn't start. "Harry," he said in a low voice, "you haven't seen a great black dog anywhere, have you?" "Yeah, I have," said Harry. "I saw one the night I left the Dursleys." Ron let his fork fall with a clatter. "Probably a stray," said Hermione calmly. Ron looked at Hermione as though she had gone mad. "Hermione, if Harry's seen a Grim, that's bad," he said. My Uncle Billy saw one once, and he died 24 hours later." "Coincidence," said Hermione airily, pouring herself some pumpkin juice. "You don't know what you're talking about," said Ron, starting to get angry. "Grim slid the living daylights out of most wizards." "Then there you are then," said Hermione in a superior tone. "They see a Grim and die out of fright. The Grim's not a bad omen. It's the cause of death. And Harry's still with us. But he's not stupid enough to see one and think, right, well, I'd better kick the bucket then." Ron mouthed wordlessly at Hermione, who opened her bag, took out her arithmetic book, and propped it in front of the big juice. "I think divination seems very woolly," she said, searching for a page. A lot of guesswork if you ask me. There was nothing woolly about the grim in that cup, said Ron hotly. You didn't seem so confident when you were telling Harry it was a sheep, said Hermione coolly. Professor Hermione said you didn't have the right aura. You just don't like it because you're bad at something for a change. He had touched a nerve. Hermione slammed the horrific book down on the table so hard the bits of meats and carrot flew everywhere. If being good at divination means I have to pretend to see death opens in the lump of tea, then I'm not sure I'll be studying it much longer. That lesson was absolute rushes compared to my arithmetic class. She snatched up her bag and stalked away. Ron frowned at her. What's Ron talking about, he said to Harry. She hasn't been to arithmetic class yet. Harry was pleased to get out of the class after lunch. Yesterday's rain had cleared and the sky was clear, pale gray, and the grass was springy damp underfoot. As they set off for their first ever care of mystical creatures, Ron and Hermione weren't speaking to each other. Harry walked beside them in silence as they went down the sloping lawns to Hagrid's hut at the edge of the Forbidden Forest. It was only when he spotted only two familiar backs ahead of them that they realized they must be having the same lessons with the Slytherins. Malfoy was talking animatedly to Crabbe and Goyle, who were chortling. Harry, quite sure he knew what they were talking about. Hagrid was waiting for his class at the door of his hut. He stood in his moleskin overcoat, with Fang the boarhound at his heels, looking impatiently to start. Come on now, get a move on, he said as class approached. Got a real treat for you today. Great lesson coming up. Everyone here? Right, follow me. For one nasty moment, Harry thought Hagrid was going to lead them into the forest. Harry had enough unpleasant experiences in there to last him a lifetime. However, Hagrid strolled around to the edge of the trees, and 5 minutes later, they found themselves outside a kind of paddock. There was nothing in there. Everyone gather around the fence here, that's it. Make sure you can see. Now, first things you want to do is open your book. How, said the cold drawing of Draco Malfoy. Said Hagrid. How do we open our books? Malfoy repeated. He took out his copy of the Monster Book of Monsters, which he had bound shut with a leather rope. Other people took theirs out too. Some people, like Harry, had belted their books shut. Others had crammed them in tight bags and clamped them together with binding clips. Hasn't anyone been able to open your books? Said Hagrid, a little crestfallen. The class shook their head. You've got to stroke 'em, said Hagrid, as though this was the most obvious thing in the world. Look. He took Hermione's copy and ripped off the spell tape that bound it. The book tried to bite, but Hagrid ran a giant forefinger down the spine, and the book shivered and then fell open and lay quiet in his hand. Oh, how silly we've been, sneered Malfoy. We should have stroked them. Why didn't we get? I thought they were funny, Hagrid said uncertainly to Hermione. Oh, tremendously funny, said Malfoy. Really witty. Giving us books that are trying to rip our heads off? Shut up, Malfoy, said Harry quietly. Hagrid was looking down from him, and Harry wanted Hagrid's first lesson to be a success. Right then, said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread. So, your books, and, you need magical creatures. So, I'll get you, and, hang on. He strode away from them into the forest and out of sight. God, this place is going to the dogs, said Malfoy loudly. That oaf teaching a class, my father will have a fit when I tell him. Shut up, Malfoy, Harry repeated. Careful, Potter, there's a Dementor behind you. Ooh, squealed Lavender Brown, pointing toward the opposite side of the paddock. Trotting towards them, there were a dozen of the most bizarre creatures Harry had ever seen. They are the bodies and hind legs and tails of horses, but their hind legs, wings, and heads of what seemed to be giant eagles, with cruel steel-colored beaks and large, brilliantly orange eyes. The talons on their front legs were half a foot long and deadly-looking. Each of the beasts had a thick leather collar around its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the ends of these held vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging into the paddock behind the creatures. Get up there, ye, he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures forward towards the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back, silently, as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence. Hippogriffs, said Hagrid, roared happily, waving the hand at them. Beautiful, aren't they? Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once he got over the first shock of seeing them, something of a half-horse, half-bird, you started to appreciate Hippogriff's gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feather to hair, each of them a different color. Storm gray, bronze, purplish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black. So, said Hagrid, rubbing his hands and beaming around, if you're wanting to come a bit nearer, no one seemed to want to go. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, approached the fence cautiously. Now, first things you gotta do about hippogriffs, he said. They're proud, said Hagrid. Easily offended hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, because it might be the last thing you do. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting how best to disrupt the lesson. You always want your hippogriffs to make the first move, Hagrid continued. It's polite, see? You walk toward them, and they bow, and you wait. If he bows back, then you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, then get away from him sharply, because those talons hurt. Right. Who wants to go first? Most of the class backed away and answered. Even Harry and Hermione had misgivings. The Hippogriffs were tossing their heads and flexing their powerful wings. They didn't seem to like being tethered like this. No one, said Hagrid in a pleading look. I'll do it, said Harry. There was an intake of breath behind him, and both Lavender and Perfeevy whispered, Oh no, Harry, remember your Tealeaves. Harry ignored them. He climbed over the paddock fence. Good man, Harry, roared Hagrid. Right then, let's see how you get with Buckbeak here. He untied one of the chains, pulled Hippogriff away from his fellows, and slipped off its collar. The class on the other side of the paddock seemed to be holding its breath. Malfoy's eyes narrowed maliciously. Easy now, said Hagrid quietly. You've got to make eye contact. Now try not to blink. Hippogriffs don't trust you if you blink too much. Harry's eyes immensely began to water, but he didn't shut them. Buckbeak turned his great sharp head and stared at Harry, one fierce orange eye. That's it, said Hagrid. That's it, Harry. Now bow. Harry didn't much like exposing the back of his neck to Buckbeak, but he did what he was told. He gave a short bow and then looked up. The Hippogriff was staring hotly at him and didn't move. Ah, said Hagrid, sounding worried. Right, back away, Harry. Now, easy does it. Then, to Harry's enormous surprise, the Hippogriff suddenly bent its scaly knees and sank into what was unmistakably a bow. Well done, Harry, said Hagrid, ecstatic. Right, yeah, now you can touch him. Pat his beak, go on. Feeling that a better reward would be to back away, Harry moved slowly towards the Hippogriff and reached out towards it. He patted its beak several times, and the Hippogriff closed its eyes lazily, as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause, all except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were looking deeply disappointed. Right then, Harry, said Hagrid. I reckon he might let you ride him. This was more than Harry had bargained for. He was used to a broomstick, but he wasn't sure a Hippogriff was quite the same. You climb up just there, behind the wing joint, said Hagrid, and mind him, don't pull any of the feathers out. He won't like that. Harry put his foot on top of Buckbeak's wing and hoisted himself onto its back. Buckbeak stood up. Harry wasn't sure what was going on. Everything in front of him was covered with feathers. Go on then, roared Hagrid, slapping the Hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12-foot wings flapped open on either side of Harry, and he had just in time to seize Hippogriff around the neck before he was soaring upward. It was nothing like a broomstick, and Harry knew in which he preferred. The Hippogriff's wings were uncomfortably on either side of him, catching him under his legs and making him feel as he was about to be thrown off. The glossy feathers slipped under his fingers, and he didn't dare get a stronger grip. Instead of the smooth action of the Nimbus 2000, he now felt himself rocking backwards and forwards on the hindquarters of the Hippogriff, warmed up and fell with its wings. Buckbeak flew him once around the paddock and then headed back to the ground. This was the bit Harry had now been dreading. He leaned back as the smooth neck lowered, feeling as though he was going to slip off the beak, then felt a heavy thud as the four ill-assorted feet hit the ground. He had just managed to hold off and push himself straight again. Good work, Harry, roared Hagrid, as everyone except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle cheered. Okay, anyone else want to go? Emboldened by Harry's success, the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the Hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backward from his, which didn't seem to want to bend his knees. Ron and Hermione practiced on chestnut, while Harry watched. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had taken over Buckbeak. He had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting his beak, looking disdainful. This is very easy, Malfoy drawled, loud enough for Harry to hear him. I knew it must have been easy if Potter could do it. I bet you're not dangerous at all. Are you really, you big ugly brute? It happened in a flash of steely talons. Malfoy let out a high-pitched scream, and in the next moment, Hagrid was wrestling Buckbeak back to his collar as he strained to get Malfoy, who lay curled in the grass, blood blossoming over his robes. I'm dying, Malfoy yelled in a panic. I'm dying, look, it's killed me. You're not dying, said Hagrid, who had gone very white. Someone help me. Gotta get him out of here. Hermione ran over to hold open the gate as Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Harry saw that there was a long, deep gash on Malfoy's arm. Blood spurted on the grass as Hagrid ran through him down the slope towards the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed the wall. The Slytherins were all shouting about Hagrid. They should fire him right away, said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. It was Malfoy's fault, snapped Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly. They all climbed the stone steps into the deserted entrance floor. I'm going to go see if he's okay, said Pansy, and they all watched her run up the marble staircase. The Slytherins, still muttering about Hagrid, headed away in the direction of their dungeon, common room. Harry, Ron, and Hermione proceeded upstairs to the Gryffindor Tower. Do you think he'll be alright, said Hermione nervously. Of course he will. Madame Pomfrey will mend any cuts in a second, said Harry, who had far worse injuries mended magically by the nurse. That was a really bad thing to happen in Hagrid's first class though, wasn't it, said Ron, looking worried. Trust Malfoy to mess things up for him. They were among the first to reach the Great Hall in dinner time, hoping to see Hagrid, but he wasn't there. They wouldn't fire him, would they, said Hermione anxiously, not touching her steak kidney pudding. They'd better not, said Ron, who wasn't eating either. Harry was watching the Slytherin table. A large group, including Crabbe and Goyle, were huddled together, deep in conversation. Harry was sure they were cooking up their own version of how Malfoy was injured. Well, you can't say it wasn't an interesting first day, said Ron gloomily. They went up the crowded Gryffindor common room after dinner and tried to do their homework Professor McGonagall had given them. But all three of them kept breaking off and glancing out the tower window. There's a light on Hagrid's window, said Harry, suddenly. Ron looked at his watch. If we hurry, we could go down and see him. It's still quite early. I don't know, said Hermione slowly, and Harry saw her glance at him. I'm allowed to walk across the grounds, he said pointedly. Sirius Black hasn't got past the Dementors yet, has he? So they put their things away and headed out to the portraits, glad to meet no one on their way out to the front doors, as they weren't entirely sure they weren't supposed to be out. The grass was still wet and looked almost black like the twilight. They reached Hagrid's hut and they knocked, and a low voice growled, "Come in." Hagrid was sitting in his shirt sleeves at his scrubbed wooden table. His boarhound Fang had his head on Hagrid's lap. One look told Hagrid that he'd been drinking a lot. There was a pewter tankard that was almost as big as a bucket in front of him, and it seemed to be having difficulty getting them to focus. "Expect it's a record," he said thickly, when he recognized them. "Don't reckon they've ever seen a teacher who lasted one day before." "You hadn't been fired, Hagrid," gasped Hermione. "Not yet," said Hagrid miserably, taking a huge gulp of whatever was in the tanker. "But it's only a matter of time, isn't it? After Malfoy." "How is he?" said Ron, as they all sat down. "It wasn't serious, was it?" "Madame Pomfrey fixed him up best she could," said Hagrid. "But all they're saying is he's still in agony, covered in bandages and moaning." "He's faking it," said Harry at once. "Madame Pomfrey can mend anything. She ruined half my bones last year. Trust Malfoy to milk it for what it's worth." "School governor's been told, of course," said Hagrid miserably. "They reckon I started too big. Shoulda let Hippogriff for later. Done Flubbleworms or summat. Just thought it might have been good for first lessons. All my fault." "It was Malfoy's fault, Hagrid," Hermione said earnestly. "We're all witnesses. You said the Hippogriffs attack if you insult them. It's Malfoy's problem that he wasn't listening. We'll tell Dumbledore what really happened." "Yeah, don't worry, Hagrid. We'll back you up," said Ron. Tears leaked out of the twinkled chunk of Hagrid's beetle-black eyes. He grabbed both Harry and Ron and pulled them into a bone-breaking hug. "I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid," said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it. Maybe she's right," said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair and followed Hermione unsteadily outside. Then they heard a loud splash. "What's he done?" said Harry nervously, as Hermione came back into the empty tankard. "Stuck his head into the water barrel," said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long-haired beard sopping wet, wiping the water out of his eyes. "That's better," he said, shaking his head like a dog drenching them all. "Listen, it was good of you to come see me. I really..." Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as he only had just saw him and realized. "What do you think you're doing here?" he roared so suddenly that they jumped foot. "You're not to go wandering around after dark, Harry, and you two letting him." Hagrid stole over to Harry, grabbed him by his arm, and pulled him out the door. "Come on," Hagrid said angrily. "I'm taking y'all out back towards the school, and don't let me catch you walking around to see me after dark again. I'm not worth it." Oh wow, things really got interesting with Harry, Hagrid, and all of their friends. What do you think, Bumblebee? I'm excited for the next adventure too. We'll see you later, okay? And we'll see you on the next adventure, here with Wayne Reads. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye!